Welcome to Gevercom, where the wise get wiser. Well, we're going to be looking at the 11th letter of the Hebrew alphabet in this lesson. And with that, we're going to look at a few key words, such as the word for holy, and even the word for priest, and one that's very important in Leviticus, Purim, which is atonement, right, or covering. So very important in the sacrificial and even the salvific purification of the people of God. So along with this, we are also going to look at a few interesting and key verses from the book of Genesis. One from early on with the creation and another with Abraham as it relates to the covenant. Both very important, fundamental verses for the whole of the Bible. Well, let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's go ahead and get started with our alphabet. As I said, we're going to be looking at the 11th letter of the alphabet, the Kaf. But before we get into it, as we often do, let's go ahead and practice our full alphabet and review our letters. So I'm going to do this quickly, so if you are able, please follow along. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, that's our alphabet. Now let's do it just a little bit slower and make sure we are catching on here. So our first letter here, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, or Wow, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, He, Sade, Kof, Re, or Re, Sin, Shin, and Tav. All right, good. Well, let's do it again together. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, that's the alphabet. Hopefully it's feeling a little more comfortable at this point. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at this letter, the letter Kaf. Now, Kaf is a unique letter in a couple ways, but one of those, which is somewhat new to us here, is that there's actually two variations of this same letter. And we're going to look at these a little closer, but just for general sake here, we have our regular form and our final form. So regular form, final form. So as the name of it suggests, this final Kaf or Kaf Sofit is only found at the end of words. So you'll never see this anywhere else in the Hebrew word except when it's the last letter of the word, which implies that everywhere else you're going to see this form, okay, the regular form. All right, well, let's look at how we write these. Well, let's begin with our regular form, and the regular form is actually pretty simple. If you see here, it fills the whole space for our normal letters, but it's kind of this little half moon shape, right? A little crescent, if you will, which, if you recall, this is just what it looks like in the English, right? The C letter, K, as in cat. So, literally, in Hebrew, the regular form Kaf is exactly the same as our English letter C, K. It's just backwards. And that's because Hebrew is written right to left instead of left to right, but exactly the same letter. So hopefully that helps and doesn't confuse you. All right, so again, just think of you're writing a C, but backwards. That's our regular form. Now for the final form, we start by putting a little line, a horizontal line near the top. We've seen this quite a few times with other letters. But what's interesting or unique about this one is that it goes from this top dash or the top line through the entirety of the space and actually extends below our normal space. Okay, and as we're going to see with some comparisons, this is very important. This is what distinguishes this letter. So we see here our final kaf, the kaf sofit, is a line at the top and then a really long line that goes all the way past below our space. Okay, and so that's our final form. So again, here we have our regular form, which looks like a backwards C. And then we have our final form, which is only at the very end of a word. And it's unique because it goes beneath our space, our normal letter space. All right, well, let's look at a few different fonts, again, just to help us be aware and be ready for different variations that we might come across. So in this font, as you can see, a regular kaf looks very much like the normal English C, but just backwards. And in this one, it's a little more rounded, as you see here. So again, the final form here, maybe like a shepherd's staff or something. Again here, a little bit more angled, perhaps a bit more fancy-ish. But hopefully you can still distinguish the two different variations here from what we've already seen. Again, a little bit more simplified, but still, hopefully you're able to see some of these features that are important for us to notice for these letters and the two variations. All right, well, we can also think about the old or ancient early versions of the letter Kaf. So in Proto-Sinaitic, again, probably around the time of, say, Moses, we have this original form, Kaf, which, similar to Yod, means hand, or maybe even the bottom of your foot. So more specifically, it means like the palm of your hand or the sole of your foot for Kaf. So as we see here, this picture is, presumably to be a hand, like the actual palm of a hand, whereas Yod means a little bit more like an arm or the forearm even. All right, well, then in Paleo-Hebrew, it does change just a little bit, and maybe it's simplified, maybe there's other factors going on here, but it does look a little bit different than the original form. However, in some ways, it actually looks perhaps a little bit more like our English K, which of course is eventually where the letter K comes from. All right, now a couple things to know about the letter Kaf is that the Kaf is that K sound, K. So although in English we could say the C with a K sound, sometimes in English we also give it a S sound, right? As in like circus, right? However, in Hebrew, this Kaf is only the K sound, as in the K, the hard K sound. However, like I said, the Kaf is unique in a couple ways. So first of all, it has a regular form and a final form, as we've already seen. But to make it even more complicated and confusing, it also has a doggish form and a non-doggish form. Oh man, come on, give us a break here, right? Well, we've already seen this doggish form in a few other letters like the Bet and the Gimel, the Dalet. However, like a couple of others we've seen, Gimel and Dalet, the doggish form and the non-doggish form generally don't have a different sound in modern times, though in ancient times they probably did. So nowadays we pretty much just pronounce them as the k sound, though sometimes people will pronounce this one without the dogish, a bit more like the chet, right? So more like a ch sound, kind of that aspirated, airy sound, and this one more like the hard k sound, k versus ch. Okay, but again, it's a nuance and really more of a kind of a particular to different people and pronunciations. All right, so keep that in mind. This is one of those letters that has the dogish form and also that final form. So it's special in two different ways. All right, well, let's look at a couple letters that our kaf is similar to, and we really need to be good at distinguishing them, especially on the front end here when we're just learning. These are going to be really difficult for us to identify. I promise as you get more familiar, it will not be difficult at all, but for now, it will be. So on the right here, we have our kaf letter, right? The kaf. As you see, it looks more like a C. It's nice and rounded. However, on the left, we have our bet letter, bet, the B sound or V sometimes. Now, the way to distinguish these, at least the way I like to, is to notice that the bet has this nice, flat, square bottom here. And that's because if you remember, the bet letter means the word house. So a house has a foundation. So our letter bet for house has a nice square foundation. Okay? And if you can remember that, then hopefully you can remember that the kaf does not. The kaf is just rounded, and it's like our English letter C. Okay? So kaf is like English C, and the bet has a foundation for a house. Okay? Well, let's look at our final form. Now, this one is, as I've found with students, to be very challenging. And as you see here, there are several letters that can very easily be mistaken for the kaf or vice versa. The one that it looks most similar to is, of course, the letter dalet. Dalet, okay, the D sound. And as you can see here, they both are essentially almost the exact same in form. The only difference is that the final kaf will be extended past our line or our space for a normal letter space. But as you can see here, it's a very small, nuanced piece of that letter. Okay, so as you get better and more familiar with Hebrew in general, you'll be able to pick up and tell when you're looking at the kaf versus the dalet, especially because if you remember, as we just mentioned, this final kaf will only be at the very end of a word, but the dalet can be anywhere, okay? Now, it can be at the end of a word, but this final kaf will only be at the end of a word, okay? So, a challenging, very similar letter here. Another couple here that often are confused, I find with students, is the vav and the zayin. And that's partly because in many of these fonts, the vav and the zayin are both written with a little bit of a top to it, a little bit of a top hat. But if you notice here, the final kaf is, first of all, much more pronounced, right? It's a much more official top piece, and it's horizontal, unlike the zayin. And again, compared to these two, the vav and the zayin, this final kaf does extend below the space for the letters. So all these other letters, the dalet, the vav, and the zayin, do not extend below. They stay inside of our lines for normal letters, okay? But again, in context, sometimes this will be hard to notice, and so you'll kind of have to keep it in mind as you are coming to the end of words and trying to decipher which one is which. So hopefully this will help you as you dive into scripture and struggle, even wrestle with the text. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at a few key words. And we're going to begin here with our words for holy or honor. So, excuse me, not holy, but glory. So we have the verb first here, which is kaved, which means he was honored, or perhaps more generically, he was heavy. So the sense of glory or honor is to be weighty. And so it could either mean to be heavy or to be honored, glorified. And then we have our noun form, kavod. And so kavod is just the noun form, or sometimes in the sense of an adjective, right? To be holy, or excuse me, heavy, honored, glorified. All right, so we have kaved and kavod. He was honored. He had glory. All right, we can also look at this dual word here, the word kala, and kol. Kala, kol. And these also are similar related words. Kala is the verb, meaning he stopped, or ended, or ceased. Kala. And then we have our adverb, which is a fairly common word. You'll see it quite often. And it's the word kol, and this means all, or every, or each. Now, it doesn't have to mean all in the way we often mean it, in the sense of, absolute all, but it just means all in a general sense, right? So sometimes it's used a bit more precisely, if you will, to mean all, and sometimes just more generally, kind of metaphorically, to mean all, or the whole. So to say, with your whole heart, right? Kol lev, or kol levav. So your whole heart. All right, we can look at another word here, and this is the word for priest. Kohen. And perhaps you've even heard this as a last name. It's a somewhat common last name for people from Jewish descent, and it really is just the word priest. So in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, it's common to hear this word kohen, or kohanim, to refer to the priests, the priestly order. All right, now I would like to bring up these three different words, or these three variations here, because this is, again, something I've found to be very confusing, or difficult for students, especially as they're getting started. They look and sound, or excuse me, they all sound the same, but they all look a little different. And so I want to help, alleviate a little bit of the confusion here. So we have first here the word kol, with this vowel here, which we normally hear as the A sound, but in this case, it's actually an O sound, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail with grammar later on. So kol, which means all. And then the word that we just looked at a minute ago here, and that's the word kol, again, which means all. So kol, all, kol, all. And so these are the exact same word, and for certain grammatical reasons, you'll have one variation or the other. So when the word is by itself or independent, it'll be like this, kol. But when the word is attached or connected to another word, usually with that little makaf there, then it will be written in this form here. So it has the exact same sound, it has the exact same meaning, but they look a little bit different. And, that can be confusing for people as they're getting started. Now, this last one here, kol, is actually written with a different first letter, as you notice here, a different consonant, the kof, as we'll learn later on. And this word kol, is actually that word for sound or voice. So very different in meaning. This kol meaning all, this kol meaning voice or sound, as in the voice of the Lord, right? All right, well, let's look at another interesting word here, and that's the word Kena'ani. Kena'ani. All right, and this is actually that word for Canaanite, as in somebody from the land or region of Canaan. Now, Canaanite or Canaan is a bit of a generic, general term for most of the peoples who were sort of original to the land, if you will. As opposed to people like Abraham, the Hebrews, the Amorites, who were more like travelers or immigrants, people who had come and settled there later. So the Canaanites were really a composite of many different groups from the region of what we think of as Israel, Palestine, but also including Syria and so forth in ancient times. But it was primarily the Hebrew Bible that refers to these peoples as Canaanites. And I think that's probably because most of them had their own kind of tribal group names. And so really it was the Israelite people who referred to them more generally as Canaanites. All right, now we can look at the word katav. Katav. And katav is one of those interesting and important words for he wrote. He wrote, katav. So as you can see here, katav is a nice, easy verb form to analyze or to look at the different patterns for the verb forms. Very nice and consistent. But you'll notice here that our kaf has that dogish. And as we'll learn again later with some of the grammar, whenever a kaf begins a word, you're going to see that dogish in it, typically. All right? So, katav, he wrote. All right, another very similar but very different word, and that is the word karat. Karat. And karat means he cut. He cut. And as we'll see in our verse from with Abraham in Genesis 15, karat can mean to simply cut, but it can also mean to make a covenant. Karat berit. So make a covenant or cut a covenant. And that's probably because the ritual or the procedure for making a covenant would have been to cut and sacrifice an animal. And so perhaps kind of literally referring to the cutting of an animal for the sacrifice, or a little bit symbolically in the sense of if you break this covenant, then you will be cut in half, like the offering that was being cut, the animal. In either case, it has kind of a similar sense here, and may seem a little bit weird to us, but cut, normally we just translate to mean to make a covenant. All right, and finally here we have our word for atonement or to cover. So very important words, especially in Leviticus, as we find in Leviticus 16, which is the center of the Torah. It's the center of the book of Leviticus. Again, this is to literally symbolize the importance of God's atonement, his covering, his forgiving of the people's sin each and every year. However, as we find in the New Testament, Jesus in the book of Hebrews fills and replaces that yearly ritual once and for all. He is both the priest, the high priest, and the offering itself, who covers and atones and removes the sin and guilt from the people of God, those who call on the name of the Lord. So we have here the word kafar, which means he covered or atoned. So sometimes it just means to cover, but it can also be in the sense of to cover sins, which later gets, in English, I suppose, gets used in the sense of to atone. Right? But it just means he covered. And similarly, the act of or the result of this covering is Kippur. Right? So Yom Kippur, the day of atonement, the day of covering. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into our verses here. And we're going to see several of our key words, of course, and talk a little bit about the importance of some of the different words and just the biblical theology we find in these verses. So let's go ahead and read these words and verses. So we have here, Vayekulu, 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 Ha Shamayim, Ha Shamayim, Vayekulu, Ha Shamayim. All right, well, what does this mean? As we've seen quite often, we see this va or va, so and then we have ye, kulu. So this is actually the root word for kala, if you remember kala, meaning to cease or to stop. So here we have they, so the yod plus this vav, this u sound. Vayekulu means and they ceased, or perhaps were finished. So and they were finished, or and they ceased. And then we have ha shamayim. Now, of course, we remember the word ha. It's very common for it to be attached to a word, as we see here. The, ha, the, shamayim. Shamayim meaning heavens. So, and the heavens were finished or completed, or they were ceased. All right, next part here. Ve haaretz. Ve haaretz. Ve kol tzevaam. Tzevaam. Ve kol tzevaam. Ve haaretz. Ve kol tzevaam. All right, well, what does that mean? Well, again, we see this and the ha, the, right? Very common. And the audits, the earth. You've seen that before, of course. So, and the earth. So, of course, this is building from that previous line. So, and the heavens and the earth were finished or were ceased. The kol, and all tzavaam. Now, tzavam or tzava is the word that means, it's sometimes translated host, but it really is the word that means like an army. So in a more kind of pleasing way for us as English speakers, we often hear it translated as host, but really it kind of just means like army. So the heavens and the earth and all of their hosts or all of their armies. And so this at the end here being there, the preposition there, the pronoun there. So interestingly, this is kind of just trying to capture the sense that everything on earth and in heaven was made, was created, or ceased being created. Okay, so that's a very interesting and powerful word there. So on the seventh day, by the seventh day, everything had ceased to be created. So it's interesting to think about, at least regarding the different debates for how the creation took place and when it took place. All right, well, let's continue this in verse 3, which adds to this a little bit more, and even adds a little bit of the weight and gravity to what's being discussed here. So let's read this. We have Vayevarek, 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 Elohim. Hopefully that sounds familiar. Elohim, et Yom. And we talked about that one recently. Et Yom, Ha Shavi'i, Ha Shavi'i, Vayevarek Elohim et Yom, Ha Shavi'i. All right. Well, what do we have here? Well, as you might suspect, we have this word and, va, and, ye, which is very commonly used here in the sense of he, okay, part of a verb. And then barak. We learned that word a while back, but it is that word meaning to bless. So, and he blessed. And we might ask, who? Who blessed? And Elohim blessed. So, and God blessed. So again, this is building from Genesis 1, right? God created. God blessed. Et Yom. And Yom means day. And of course, which day? He blessed Ha Shavi'i, which is the word for 7. Or in this case, 7th. So the 7th day. So in God blessed the 7th day, right? Because the earth and the heavens and everything in them had ceased being created. All right. Then we see here, Va Ye Kadeh. Va Ye Kadeh. Va Ye Kadeh. Oto. Ki. Vo. Shavat. Va Ye Kadesh Oto Ki Vo Shavat. All right. Well, what do we have here? Well, again, we see that and, va, and again that yod on the front of a verb, meaning he. So, and he made holy, or perhaps sanctified. He made holy. So, and he made, speaking of God, so and God made holy oto. Now, we've seen that word o before, right? It usually means him or it, okay? So, and he made holy it, referring to the day, the 7th day. Ki, remember this one? I said write it down. We'll see it all the time. It means for, because, sometimes that. So, he made it holy for vo. Now, this one's a little tricky because it's actually 2 different words. Our preposition be, meaning in, and then o again. O, it. So for, in it, meaning the day, the 7th day. Shavat. Shavat. Now this is interesting because, again, this is kind of relating to or paralleling that word kala, to cease or to stop. And so here, oftentimes, it can be related to the sense of to rest, but it also just means to cease or to stop. All right. And so what did he cease from? Mikol melakato. Mikol melakato. Melakto. Mikol melakto. All right. So what do we have here? Well, me, which we've seen quite a bit, is a preposition meaning from, right? So he ceased or stopped from kol. All right, that's that word. So, and this is in that form that is a little bit weird looking because it has this other vowel, but it's just the sound kol. And as you can see here, that's because it's attached to this next word. All right, but it still sounds like kol. So mikol, from all, melakto. So this here is for the word like deeds or work. And then, of course, o, which we've already seen a bunch. But in this case, it means his, referring to God. So from all his work, or all of his deeds. All right. So the Lord made it holy, the 7th day, because he had ceased from all of his work. All right. And then it continues here with Asher bara Elohim la'asot. Asher bara Elohim la'asot. Asher bara Elohim la'asot. All right, well, what does this mean? Well, we've seen asher many times before, usually in the sense of which or that or sometimes who. So in this case, that, bara, from Genesis 1:1, right? He created, so right? Bara Elohim, the Lord God created, la'asot. And then this is a little bit complicated, but it just means to do or to make. So as we see here, he blessed this seventh day, for in this seventh day he ceased from all of his deeds, which God had created or made to do. And then we have our next verse here, but let's talk about this just briefly. So in the seventh day, we see the parallel of Exodus, right? For our command to honor the Sabbath, that seventh day. And it refers to this time here from Genesis chapter 2, especially 1 through 3. And this is the reason that Israel was supposed to be marked by this special week that they were meant to represent and reflect the very ways of their God. Now, we can take that for granted and turn it into a very legalistic law, but at its core, the whole goal was to teach Israel, to teach the people of God to be like the people, to be like their God, their Father. And so just as God ceased from his work on the seventh day, so his people should also cease from their work on the seventh day. And this is important because at the time there wasn't as set of a common week or work week that we might think. And this is important, especially because it wasn't only for the people of Israel, but also their servants and the outsiders. Even their animals weren't supposed to work. So really, this was meant to permeate all of their society, again, to reflect their love, devotion, and reflection of God, their Father. All right, well, let's now look at Genesis 15:18 with Abraham and the covenant God made with him. So let's go ahead and read this here. We have Bayom, Hahu, Harat, Adonai. Bayom Hahu Karat Adonai. Bayom Hahu Karat Adonai. All right, well, what do we have here? Well, as we've often seen, this preposition attached, which means in, be, or ba. So in the yom, day. So in the day. And then we have hahu. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because the word who normally just means he or it. But whenever you see this ha, meaning the, added to it, you know for sure it can't mean he or it. Because you would never, just like in English, you'd never say the he or the it. Well, in Hebrew, you wouldn't either. So this is to indicate it means the word that. So in that day. So in that day, Karat Adonai. So, of course, we see here the Lord cut. So, in that day, the Lord cut. And then we have Et Avram Berit. Berit. Et Avram Berit. Et Avram Berit. So, of course, Avram is just the name Abram, which becomes shortly after the name Abraham. But first, he was just called Abram or Avram. And then we have that word Berit, which means a covenant. So as I had already mentioned, it's a little bit odd for us to say or to think, but the Lord cut a covenant with Abraham. And so in this case, it means that he made a covenant or a promise or an agreement with Abraham. And what was this promise? Well, we see here, lemor, le zaraka natati. Lemor, le zaraka natati. All right. So what does this mean? Well, lemor is from the word amar, meaning to say or to speak. So in this form, with that preposition le, it just means to speak, or perhaps saying, as we would say it in English, right? So he cut a covenant with Abraham saying, le, to, or perhaps for, and remember that word ka, your seed or your offspring. So to your offspring, to your seed, natati. This is from the word natan, meaning I have given. I have given. And then we see et haaretz chazot. Et haaretz chazot. So what is this? Well, again, we've seen this word et, and it's typically not translated in English because it's not really necessary. It is really just indicating what is not the subject. So what is the verb doing, right? He's giving haaretz. He's giving the land. I am giving you, or your seed, your offspring, the land. And specifically, chazot. And this means this land. So chazot. And zot is just the word meaning this, but with ha, it helps connect these two together. So to say this land specifically, right? So this was a part of the covenant that Abraham has, or that God has made with Abraham. Mi nahar Mitzrayim. Min nahar Mitzrayim. Minachar Mitzrayim. All right, well, what does this mean? Well, we have that preposition again, mi, meaning from, nahar, river, and then Mitzrayim. So this is the river of Egypt. So, of course, what we would call the Nile River, the great river of Egypt, the Nile River. So from the Nile River, ad ha-nahar ha-gadol, nahar perat. Ad ha-nahar ha-gadol, nahar perat. Which means ad, as far as or until, ha, the, nahar, river, ha-gadol, great. So as you can see here, it's very common, and we'll talk about this more in the grammar section later. When you have a noun like nahar, and you have the attached, the adjective like gadol, big or large, must also have the attached. So it seems redundant in English, but this is how Hebrew did it. So as far as the great river, or the large river, the big one, which we might say is called Nahar Perat, or that is the river Euphrates, the Euphrates River. So Abraham was promised to inherit the land from the Euphrates all the way to the Nile River. So the entirety of that land was supposed to be given to Abraham and his descendants, which, of course, is given to Abraham, okay? And so we do end up seeing that Abraham's descendants, which actually include much more than just Israel, of course, do end up filling and inhabiting the entirety of that land. Though they, throughout their history, experienced a lot of turmoil and war and invasion, even exile, and destruction. And so of all the nations within that territory, Israel really is the only one remaining between that territory. And amazingly have been restored to that part of the land, at least in a small portion. But originally, this promise, the covenant that God made with Abraham, was at least partially, if not primarily, a land covenant for his descendants, for his seed. Well, let's go ahead and finish up here with our alphabet. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, again, I hope you learned something, and I do hope that you will share something. And I look forward to seeing you next time when we learn the letter Lamed.